I'm Wesley Morris, and I am a critic at the New York Times.
From David's Werner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think.
I've only experienced the art rivalries as ways to understand eras and moments, but I never quite understood how the public received, or if they even perceived, rivalry in the proliferation of the works themselves.
I'm Helen Molesworth, your host for this season. Every episode features a conversation with artists, curators, writers, designers, philosophers, filmmakers, and musicians about what it means to make things today. Hey, everybody. Today we're bringing you another special episode, a conversation with the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times cultural critic, Wesley Morris. Wesley and I dig into the age-old question of rivalry. It occurs in just about every arena, from sports to art to cultural criticism. We riff on rivalry's merits, its pitfalls, and its long history, spanning everybody from Manet and Degas to Kendrick and Drake. The next season of Dialogues launches in March, so be sure to follow us here for new episodes dropping soon. Now, here's me and Wesley Morris. Welcome to Dialogues. I'm so happy that you're here. For those of you who don't know Wesley Morris, you're in for a treat. He is the co-host with Jay Wortham of the cultural podcast Still Processing. And more recently, you were the host of The Wonder of Stevie, a multi-part podcast about the American genius, Stevie Wonder. And I loved The Wonder of Stevie.
Thank you.
And I wanted you to come on the podcast to talk about something that I'm really curious about, which is artistic rivalry.
Mm-hmm.
And what I kind of felt like was the absence of serious artistic rivalries in our current moment. And what did that mean for our moment? Now, we happen to be talking in the wake of one of the biggest artistic rivalries ever to capture public imagination, that being, of course, the rap battle, although it goes beyond rap battle, I think.
We're so far past
We're
that.
so far past rap battle. But again, for any of us listeners, Dialogues listeners who aren't up to speed on what is going on between Drake and Kendrick Lamar, there are many articles that sum it all up for you, so you can catch up.
Yeah, the New York Times podcast, The Daily, did an episode the Friday before the Super Bowl about just the nuts and bolts of the situation, including the lawsuit that Drake has filed against Universal Music Group, which represents both him and Kendrick Lamar. So
correct. And New York Magazine, The Intelligencer, has got a breakdown of the lyrics for those of you who just need to know like which songs hit when and what the offending lyrics were in each song. It's also a nice little Baedeker through this intense rivalry. But I don't know, maybe we could put that, we could hold it in parentheses and just talk a little bit about the role rivalry plays in art and culture. One of the things I've always thought it helped people do was get better at doing what they do.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you think about rivalry in the field of culture.
I definitely agree that it strengthens and sharpens and inspires. I think to just like hang out with Kendrick and Drake for a second. You know, Kendrick had said at some point that in life, this is almost philosophical. I mean, it is philosophical, but because most of what he speaks is received as, or quite legitimately, a philosophical act. But he essentially, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he's essentially a believer in there being love and there being war. And both of these impulses are necessary. He didn't say exactly for what, but I think that they're necessary human expressions of the self and of civilization. It's a civilizational need. And I think that if you're creating something, I mean, you can certainly create it in a vacuum or a void. You could also not feel called to respond to rivalry, but you can also sense, I grew up in a time, and I'm now, the older I get, the more I can see that these rivalries have existed throughout history. But I grew up in a time when, I think that rivalries were presented as dichotomies, right?
Right.
Even when the dichotomous particulates were seemingly similar in some way. Like, what was the meaningful enough difference between Madonna and Cyndi Lauper, or Tiffany and Debbie Gibson, or Bon Jovi and Motley Crue? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I don't know what really was so different, but you were expected to know what a difference was between them, and to choose between, West Coast hip hop and East Coast hip hop. Um, and we thought about them as one thing or the other. Like, this is one object that you have to have, warring feelings about.
Right. Although my entire academic life, from being a student, was structured essentially around rivalry.
Yes,
Now, there was
yes,
Clement
yes.
Greenberg and the people who fought against Clement Greenberg. There was a sense when you sat at a bar that who you chose in any aesthetic debate
Mhm,
had something to say about yourself.
mhm,
There was a
mhm,
telegraphing of a personal identity.
mm.
But it is awfully hard, to your Madonna and Cyndi Lauper moment, to imagine trying to explain the differences between these positions and how we held on to them in our contemporary moment. I mean, even the structure of rivalry doesn't seem to hold our taste formations, our sense of ourselves in the world anymore as critics, as cultural elites. It all it's sort of washed out, and I wonder what we've lost if we lose a certain version of rivalry.
I mean, the thing about the fight between Kendrick Lamar and Drake that was so fascinating was, I mean, I don't know what their normal output was. I mean, Drake is incredibly prolific like, under ordinary circumstances, and Kendrick is not a slouch either in the putting music out department, but not at the pace that Drake does.
Right.
But there was something thrilling, and I think that the reason so many millions of us were, like, glued to our devices that weekend was that they kept delivering new music. I mean, I think 8 songs came out of that
Yep.
fight in 4 days or 5 days, maybe it was a week, I can't remember, time collapsed itself, but basically, the songs, and they were mostly really good songs. I mean, in terms of both the lyrical acuity, and, like, Drake seemed unusually focused.
Mhm.
He wasn't just creating lyrics to create them, he was sharpening tools in this fight. And I mean, but I also don't know, I mean, I think maybe there's a way to think about where rivalry has shifted, because I think, to your point, it isn't necessarily in art anymore. But it is still in our culture, right? I mean, I'm just thinking about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg challenging each other to, I mean, I'm gonna say a cage match, but I think officially it was like an MMA, you know, brawl of some kind. There is this expression of dominance that is whittled down to 2 people, and I think all of that, I mean, the cultural energy, the creative impulses really migrated someplace new. And I
Mm,
think that, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that it's an essential aspect of human existence, or at least modern human existence. But I also think that there is something useful not just for the artists who find themselves in these competitions. I mean, you can speak to this a little bit too, but I think there's something useful as a person who is aligning themselves with these people. right? Like, I'm thinking specifically about Andrew Sarris and Pauline Kael.
Mhm.
I was raised I grew up understanding that there were these 2 paradigmatic film critics, Pauline Kael on the one hand and Andrew Sarris in the other. And there really shouldn't have been too much difference between them. They just disagreed about a number of things, but the most important disagreement they had was about an idea, like an I would say that Sarris was he was what got termed an auteurist, right? A
Right.
person that believes the author of the work is the director. Um, the author of the movie is the director, and we should think of him as having absolute control over what the movie that you and I see looks like, means. And Kale, I mean, she rejected it on its face as a school, but she also kind of she believed in auteurism.
Right.
But I mean, there were people who
But she sort of
followed.
defaulted to narrative, right? Like, she always I feel like Kale defaulted to the story of the film, and Sarah
Yes,
defaulted
yes.
to what the film was doing that only a film could do, due to medium, which is
Yes. I
more
mean, yes, she saw it as a much more elastic experience than Sarah's did. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think that they wound up on the same page about a lot of things for almost the same reasons. But at the end, but also the people who grew up around these people who were coming of age as critics, they were drawn to one camp or the other camp. And that was fascinating. The Pauline Kael people were called Paulettes. I
Mhm.
don't know if the Andrew Sarris people had a name. I guess the Arturists would have been their band's name. Um, but I don't know. It was really useful for me to learn what was important to me as a thinker and as a writer and as a critic and as a person who watched movies.
Right.
Like studying the two of them and reading the two of them.
Well, one of the things you're saying is that there's a dichotomy there, there's a binary there,
Mhm.
and that binary allowed you to see what was different in each position and allowed you to sharpen your own tools as a young film critic. Art
Yeah.
history was compare and
Yeah.
contrast.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that binarism kind of fell into the hands of Rivalry as an emotional engine, drawing or color,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden you
Mhm.
have to choose.
Mhm.
This is an impossible choice. It's a dumb choice, but it is a way of thinking that sharpens the mind, that sharpens the way you look at a thing. And to your earlier, like, to drop back maybe to Kendrick and Drake and to use them as the touchpad, those 8 songs that they released in that quick succession of days, Drake's sharpening of his language is a little bit Kendrick-esque,
Mhm.
and Not Like Us is an earworm worthy of Drake himself,
Yes. Yes.
right? So
Yes.
these 2
Yes.
guys who are really hating on each other, really getting actually vicious, uh, both made music sort of in the spirit of the other.
Yeah.
It made them make better songs.
I also think what culturally happened was interesting too, because in winning, they switched places in a strange way, right? I mean, not absolutely, because Drake is actually I don't know where Drake is, right? I mean, I can only imagine what his life is like right now, what his psyche is like right now. But Kendrick, meanwhile, is having a time of his life,
Right.
right? I mean, the idea that if you had told me, like, even a year ago, that the first solo rapper to headline a Super Bowl halftime show was going to be Kendrick Lamar and not Drake.
Makes no sense.
I would have struggled to understand that. But now it makes all the sense in the world.
Right.
Kendrick Lamar has never been more popular. He's never been more he's never been more beloved. And weirdly, simultaneously on somebody else's terms and his own. Um,
Although maybe I could say I don't know if my position is lonely on Kendrick. I love Not Like Us as a song. I love an earworm. I love a big pop hit. I can't get it out of my mind. Uh,
er, 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 er,
right, I mean,
er,
it's
er, er,
so
er.
good. And the Super Bowl moment, it lost me.
Hmm.
I was like, "This is too mean, too nasty
Mhm,
to
mhm.
watch these 2 incredibly talented men battle with each other when the real enemy was sitting in a box seat
Right,
and left before halftime."
right, right.
When the real enemy
Mhm,
shut out Colin Kaepernick. Do you know what I mean? Like,
right.
in what universe did we all just give in to the deep pleasure of ugly feelings, the deep
That's
pleasure of that devilish smile that Kendrick gave to the camera that was thrilling in the moment. I can't lie. I was like, "Oh, snap." And
right.
then I thought, "Oh,
Yeah,
oh, I feel bad now."
yeah, I felt bad going in. I felt bad this whole time. It is like, this is what you don't wanna see because you know what's interesting to me, and I don't know, I'm just thinking about as we're talking, I'm like, rivalries throughout my intellectual and, like, and art experiencing life. And I don't know if the rivalries were genuine or if they were concocted for any number for like, heuristic purposes, right?
Yeah,
Pedagogical purposes.
right.
Like Brock and Picasso, for instance. It was also possible to like them both. I don't
Right. You actually don't have to choose between Matisse and Picasso. You can live a life completely embracing both of these contributions.
right. And well, I mean, and that's an even more stark opposition, right?
Right.
Um, I we were fine liking both Kendrick and Drake until this rap battle. But it also just fascinating to me, like, how quickly we turned. I mean, I guess so one thing I would ask you, because I don't really know, I've only experienced the art rivalries as ways to understand eras and moments, but I never quite understood how the public received or if they even perceived rivalry in the proliferation of the works themselves.
I think it's such a good question because I think one of the things that points to is that the rivalries, as you said, are a kind of heuristic event. And they're promulgated, I think, as much by folks like us, by
Mhm,
critics,
mhm,
by
mhm,
cultural commentators, by historians who are trying to make sense of the thing that they're looking at, create rivalries, or amplify the low key disagreements or disjuncture between different people
mm,
to make a kind of theory. So
mm,
you get, you know, Leonardo versus Michelangelo. Now, those guys had legitimate beef, like, they
right,
actually don't like each other, and
right,
there's a generational thing. Michelangelo is, like, catching up to Leonardo, and he doesn't like it and all that kind of stuff. But there's also, I think, the kind of training I've already alluded to in myself, someone like, the great historian Rosalind Krauss. She needed a whipping boy in
mm,
order to write
mhm,
something. She needed an enemy. She needed a bad object in order for herself to be brilliant,
mm,
right? And sometimes I've wondered, and this is a big question for you now, I want to ask you. So we've got all this social media affirmation, all these thumbs up, all of this talk of bringing people into community, breaking down the canon. And one of the things that's happened is that we've lost, like, really strong critical voices.
mhm.
Like, no one's willing to say, like, "Okay, man, who's it gonna be? Is it gonna be Amy Sherald or is it gonna be Rashid Johnson? Do we have to choose? Do we have to
Do
choose?"
we have to choose?
No?
Interesting. Yeah,
And it
mhm,
used to
mhm,
be, in a museum context, you kinda did as a curator. You
mhm,
were like, "Oh,
mhm,
no, I'm team Rashid. I'm team Amy. Like, this is how I'm gonna roll out my intellectual and aesthetic platform and power." But now we've sort of been asked to just be, like, really
all affirmative all the time. And I guess I'm curious,
I like this question.
what are we losing? Are we losing something? Is there another way to make people make better work than this crazy teardown we just watched between Drake and Kendrick?
Well, I mean, we're also talking about, Drake and Kendrick, an art form who that was developed and sharpened and, popularized itself through, open competition,
Right,
through open disagreement, through manufactured battle, right? Through formalized battle, right? Where strangers would come together in a room, get on stage and freestyle each other to death.
right.
Um,
But there was a community and audience that would decide who won at the end.
sure, that spirit is in the DNA of the cultural proliferation of the art form. And it's important for a long time it was important to have these battles. And once they got dangerous, we had to reconsider whether that was a good idea. I
Right,
think Biggie and Tupac were, you know, that was an obviously dark apex. But while it was happening, it felt good, right? When Tupac put Hit 'Em Up out, you just couldn't believe the things being said in this song.
right.
I think that and the song felt good. I mean, the other thing is about that song is it felt great.
I know, and that's one of the reasons Not Like Us is worth talking about as a song because it feels great, but then when I think it through, I'm like, "Really? In this moment?" So, one of the things about Rivalry, it seems to me, is it is really a complicated mix of what I would call ugly emotions.
Mhm.
You know, it gets you envy, insecurity, aversion, rage, shame, love, desire. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a
Sure.
really complicated mixture of emotions. And one of the things you're, it seems to me, suggesting is that as the audience on this one, we fell out a little bit on the rivalry by just going with the winner. Like, we're
Yeah.
not sitting in what is at stake in this really soupy mix of feelings, and what is particularly at stake in the feelings of the Kendrick song
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
Not Like Us, you know, the resistance of empathy, compassion, the refusal of the other. You know, it's pretty the lyrics are kinda tough.
They're deeper than tough, like, it is this is character assassination in every possible way, and I think Kendrick woulda left the pedophilia charge alone if he coulda sued for the colorism part.
Mhm.
Right? You can't take that part to a judge.
Right,
And I think that's the part that hurts him the most. I mean, look, Kendrick did the most to make the pedophilia the sort of salient attack. But the one that's most resonant and the most heartbreaking for me is this questioning not only of Drake's blackness, but what he intends when his musical interests and curiosities and tastes lead him to other musical ideas and styles, right?
right.
Um,
Yeah, for me, I mean, the pedophile line is, unwarranted, but the colonizer line, it's br
that's the thing that
that's
cuts
the line
deepest,
where,
right?
I stuck my teeth a little bit on that one. I'm like, "Oh, that's rough."
Right. The other thing about what rivalries I think do, I mean, how many of them were forged in actual like contempt, right?
Mm,
Um, did Pauline Kael and Andrew Sarris hate each other? Were they made better by the rivalry that came up around them? I mean, Renata Adler actually is a more might be a more interesting person to sit alongside Pauline Kael because they were actual, active rivals against each other for space
right,
in the New Yorker. And I do think that her most interesting period as a critic was the period in which those two were kind of aware of each other and, in Renata Adler's case, kind of going after Pauline Kael.
That's really interesting to me because, Kerry James Marshall, the great American painter, once said to me that he really thought the museum was similar to the sports arena in as much
Mm,
as it was a profoundly competitive space. There is only so much wall space. And so if you're going to get in and be on that wall, like you have really got to be the best,
mm,
like that you have to fight for that space, that
mm,
that is not some benign thing that is given to you by someone else, that that
mm,
is something internal to you as an artist to see that space and to fight for it. And that is about like the limited pages of the New Yorker, the limited number of seats at an Ivy League institution, the limited number of slots in the NBA. Like those, there's not a proliferation there. There's set amounts, and that's real competition. That is a kind of rivalry about who gets to be seen and who
mm,
gets to be
mhm,
read.
mhm. I also do think that the the dichotomization of Rivalry is interesting. Like, one of the great art going experiences I've had was going to see the Manet Degas show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art last year. In part because those 2 had never been presented to me as poles. And I think one of the brilliant aspects of that show was that there was a great deal of grace for the ways in which they came together and diverged. You could go through that show and I mean, I left, like, my mind blown by Manet.
Yeah.
Like, it was but I also didn't understand the breadth of Degas, right? I mean, so this is a dual expansion of 2 people who live in at least the sort of 21st century public imagination, like, reduced. And that show, by sitting them alongside each other, forces you to think about what a rivalry could be good for, um, and the bounds and depths people can go. I mean, just looking at the way horses got painted.
Right.
Who did horses better? Um, just thinking about, it was such a rich experience, that really rewarded patience and time, right? The time the eras of these 2 artists, but also the passage of the time between this era and theirs.
Right.
Um, I don't know, and I thought a lot about that show while I'm sitting in the music made by these 2 pop stars.
Right. It's interesting because I think Manet Degas too. I love that show as well. And I thought it was extremely well done because I thought one of the things it did was set up the rivalry and diffuse the rivalry almost
Yes.
simultaneously,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So,
yes.
like, it understood that somehow, a 21st century subject was gonna have a hard time seeing why these 2 guys were at each other's throats since all the
Mhm.
paintings are so fucking great. You So, like,
Yeah.
it's not like there's a good painter and a bad painter, they're 2 great painters. But that show made me think about there's a quote Helen Frankenthaler says upon apparently meeting, I don't know, Morris Lewis, and they have a rivalry because 'cause they're both using a similar painting technique. And she describes their rivalry as like you would go to she would go to his studio or he would come to her studio, and she said something like, "And all it made you wanna do was go back to your studio
Yes.
and make a
Mhm,
better painting." Like,
mhm,
to push yourself to do something better than you could do without someone kinda nipping at your heels a little
mhm,
bit.
mhm.
And that's how I understand sports rivalry. I sort of understand, that great players make each other better.
Sports is an interesting place to think about rivalry too, because you can watch it happen in real time.
Right,
Um, you can also you can see it happen over years, and if it's really a rivalry, and we're talking about a rivalry, like, between greats, the battle to get if we're talking about, like, a playoff situation, where you have to play 4 or 5 rounds of something to get to a final.
Right.
Tennis, where in a Grand Slam major tournament, you have to play 7 rounds to get to a final. You have to play 6 matches to get to the 7th match. And then you have to play that 7th match and win.
Right.
To constantly be facing the same people, the same teams after running that gauntlet is an especially delicious, rivalry because it's real, right? We didn't make this up.
Right.
You guys keep winning and finding yourself among the last of the competitors. So the
Right.
rivalry is completely legitimate. You've earned your way. You fought your way to this peak.
It's interesting because, during the pandemic, when the NBA played in the bubble,
Mm.
uh, I watched pretty much every game. And
I've more of us did than we thought would.
exactly, and every once in a while, my wife would come in and say, "Who are you rooting for?" And I would say, "Everybody. I'm
Yeah.
rooting for everybody."
I always say the sport. I'm like baseball. I don't love the Dodgers. I don't,
I
I
mean,
just want baseball.
now that the pandemic is over, I'm back to rooting for individuals and teams. But there was something about that moment that it was I understood, "Oh, man, we are all in this together. I cannot maintain any kind of rivalry under these circumstances."
Mhm,
And
mhm,
I guess
mhm,
one of the things, maybe it's to harken back a little bit to Musk and Zuckerberg, uh, but this moment in where partisanship is so intense
mhm, mhm,
and where the attacks on the other are come from all sides. Do you know what I mean? I mean, we have such a low, empty, crass public culture, it seems to me at this moment.
mhm, mhm.
And one of the things rivalry does imply is that you're not alone, that you are in some
Yeah,
intimate
yeah.
bond with the other, that like, you don't get to just be alone.
It's a love
Not how
story.
it works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Um, yeah, it's fascinating for you to frame it in the particulars of this moment because, this is not a love story.
This is not a love song.
Right? I don't think that an aspect of what got us Trump in some way was did he both loved and hated Obama,
Right. He
you know?
wants everything Obama is and cannot stand the guy at the same time.
Right. And Obama just didn't care. Right? Obama was like, "What? Who? You? Oh, I don't
Right.
care."
Met you.
And I think that really he never forgot that. I mean, it's still animating him, right? I mean, I think DEI in his mind is really just like he thinks that Obama's election was a DEI scenario, right? I mean, everything he can do and the crassness of him and the age in which he developed, I mean, I'm going to call it a sense of morality, but I mean, it's the old dark energies, right? It's the racial energies where everybody is a thing but you, and your thing as a white American male, a straight white cis American male, that is all a problem. And it's a threat, and you feel compelled to defend it. But in this particular, non-rivalry, this aspired rivalry, because I think what Trump was hoping would happen was that Obama would also go on talk shows and talk about Trump. That he would abdicate the sort of moral responsibility of his job to just talk shit all day on podcasts and CNN or whatever. But he just basically ignored him. But he hasn't had a rival since then, right? He hasn't even wanted one. He hasn't, he is so, anybody who even threatens to nip at his heels in this way, either he or, his apparatus essentially decimate. But I also just think the culture doesn't want anybody else, right? Someone will come along, right? There will be somebody who understands or has a different energy that works against those forces. But one of the things that makes this moment so terrifying is that
Mm.
there is no rival, right?
And it's one of the things that also makes this moment so terrifying is the degree to which we as a public, and I'm going to drop back to something you said about Drake and Kendrick. We gave up on Drake like that. We
Mhm,
dropped him like a hot potato after loving that man. You know what I mean? We just dropped him. We love to see people throw pebbles at the king.
mhm, mhm,
And we left Obama, and then, now all these people are like, yeah, we're done with that. We're going we're going in hard on Trump.
mhm.
I mean, is there something about this moment where we want a winner? We wanna see a winner beat someone else who was a winner? And we want something vicious and solitary instead of, complicated and, uh, imbricated with one another?
I mean, I think the wish for what you're asking about is the complication, right? Because it's a rawer, more naked version. I mean, it's old, throughout the history of this country. I mean, we're leaving the realm of rivalry for just one second to think about just hate.
Right,
Right? Murderous terror, terror and harassment and assault born of a kind. I mean, if we're just thinking about what the true rivalry of this country, it's it's white people and black people,
right,
right? That's the American rivalry. And it is still in us even as, one side, I would even say now culturally has has received a dominance, has like assumed dominance over a culture that was for a long time, it's not absent. I mean, the forces at play at that Super Bowl were, they were there,
right.
right? The new culture and the not at
Vested.
all
Well,
dormant, but less dominant culture,
right,
right? If you just look at the charts, what was the for 18 months on the pop charts, it was white men singing anything that was taking over the top 10 on the Billboard charts. And it really truly was not until this rivalry where the sport was two black men tearing each other up
mm,
that hip hop seemed as vital as it was, at the peak of Drake, you
right.
know, 5 or 6 years before this. But I'm wondering, Helen, if it is even moral to think about rivalry in the realm of politics at this moment. Do you think, I mean, in the same way that it's flattening
Right.
to not have rivalries in art and popular culture, and, admittedly, like, this is our popular culture now, right? These politics are what has consumed us.
I guess I wonder if we could make a distinction, and I don't know if we can. But I think one of the things that is dormant in the conversation about rivalry is the love, is this
Mhm.
tang
This is what I was yes,
right,
yes, I was
a
yes.
profound entanglement with the other. And what I don't see in authoritarian politics is an
Mhm, mhm,
entanglement with the other.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
What I see in authoritarian politics is a desire to eliminate the other, an inability to broker
Yes,
an
yes.
arrangement with the other. Whereas the rivalry, I guess, I mean, and your this conversation is helping me sharpen my own thoughts about it. What I miss perhaps about rivalry is the entanglement, is
Mhm,
the love, is the
mhm.
messiness of the encounter that produces then something, something great. Because I'm a aesthete at the end of the
Yeah.
day. I like great shit. You know? Do. I like a great picture and a great song and a great jacket. I love great things. And there's nothing great, in my humble estimation, about the Trump agenda. In fact, it's It's unrelentingly crass and
It's yeah.
unrelentingly crude
Mhm,
because it
mhm,
doesn't love. It
mhm.
doesn't have the other messy emotions.
Well, the love part is obviously missing, but it also is the pleasure in the pain.
Mm,
And, Adam Serwer has a great book that is called "The Cruelty Is the Point." It's just about, like, the aspects of the first Trump administration. And the idea behind that is essentially that the way for them to understand themselves as having value and power is to just completely strip anybody else of even the right to to exist.
right.
And in that, one thing about a rivalry that's uncomfortable for the rivalrists, but necessary for the rivalry is the truth.
Mm,
The
mm,
other person knows. The other person knows the number
that is true, man.
of their opponent. The balance of power shifts between the two people. So sometimes the winner is the one person, sometimes it's the other person,
And sometimes it's the sport.
and sometimes it's the sport.
Right.
But I think that the uncomfortable but, like, exciting part of the rivalry is being seen by this person that you're trying to get away from,
Mm,
and then re-seeing them, and they're trying to escape the truth of what you've seen and
right.
what they've seen in you. And I think that a huge part of what can't happen anymore with respect to, you know, shifting this moral framework from culture to politics and the shifting of our politics to culture is that in order for this moment to happen, they had to eliminate the possibility that we understand what truth even is.
Right.
So we wouldn't believe a rival to Trump, even if they did appear, because he can just say this person isn't even telling the truth.
Right.
Everything they're saying is a lie. And so nobody can really get any traction on 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 this particular set of rivals because they won't acknowledge that anybody, Teflon Don is not a joke.
No joke. But one of the things that you've done, I think, uh, and it'll sort of like I think it's the mic drop moment. There is no way to have truth without love, and there is no way to have love without truth. These two things are deeply connected, and that's something we all have to hold on to right now.
Yes. I
Um,
love you enough to hate you.
right,
I
and
love you enough to tell the truth about you.
that's right, and I hate you enough to understand that in there is love, because if you get me that riled, you got me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wesley Morris, damn. Thank you for coming on and talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Helen. I really enjoyed this.
Dialogues is produced by David Zwerner. If you like this episode, please follow, rate, and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really does help the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you join us here next time.